Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere that can seem very familiar at first, and then strangely distant the longer you look at it. A small village, a few timber houses, smoke in the air, animals in the yard, fields beyond the lane. It sounds simple, but inside that simplicity was an entire world of rules, labor, faith, fear, and survival. To spend just one ordinary day in a medieval village was to live inside a system so tightly ordered that even the ringing of a bell could shape the rhythm of your life. And before we begin, if you enjoy calm, thoughtful history told slowly and clearly, subscribing is a good way to stay connected with the channel. A lot of regular viewers subscribe so they don't miss future long-form journeys like this one, and it really helps more people find these quieter, more careful history stories. Now, to understand a day in a medieval village, we need to set aside the image of the Middle Ages as nothing but castles, kings, and battles. For most people in medieval Europe, life was not lived in royal courts or stone fortresses. It was lived in villages, small settlements surrounded by open fields, patches of woodland, streams, rough paths, and strips of cultivated land that had been worked by the same families for generations. The village was not just where people slept. It was the center of existence. It shaped work, worship, marriage, law, food, status, and even the imagination of what the wider world might be. The day usually began in darkness. In a medieval village, artificial light was weak and expensive, and so daily life followed the sun much more closely than modern life does. In winter, mornings were cold, dim, and slow to emerge. In summer, the day could begin very early. A peasant household might wake before sunrise, not because of an alarm clock, but because animals needed feeding, embers needed reviving, and there was too much work waiting to waste daylight. Sleep itself was not always uninterrupted in the modern sense. Many people likely woke during the night, tending the fire, checking animals, or simply lying awake in the silence before resting again. Inside the house, the air could already be thick with the smell of smoke, straw, damp timber, and livestock. Many medieval village homes were modest structures made of wood, wattle, and daub, with thatched roofs and earthen floors. The largest and most prosperous households might have more than one room, but many families lived in close quarters. Privacy, as modern people understand it, was rare. People slept together, worked together, ate together, and endured cold, illness, noise, and fatigue together. Life was shared because survival required it. The first task was often the fire. If the hearth had gone low during the night, someone had to coax it back to life. Fire meant warmth, light, and the ability to prepare food. A household that failed to maintain its fire faced immediate discomfort and inconvenience. Then came the animals. Chickens, pigs, sheep, goats, or a cow. If the family was fortunate enough to own one, all demanded attention. In some homes, animals were kept very close to human living space, especially in poor weather, because they were valuable and vulnerable. They were not pets in the modern sense. They were wealth, labor, food, and insurance against disaster. Breakfast was usually plain. Bread was central to medieval diet, though the quality varied dramatically depending on wealth and local harvests. Ale was also common, often weaker than modern beer, and safer than questionable water sources in some places. Pottage, a thick stew of grains and vegetables simmered over time, was one of the great foundations of village life. It could be endlessly adjusted depending on season, availability, and fortune. Cabbage, onions, leeks, peas, beans, oats, barley, and sometimes a little dairy or meat might all find their way into the pot. For most villagers, meals were built not around abundance, but around endurance. Food had to carry people through long hours of labor. Once morning fully arrived, the whole village began to move. This was not movement in the modern sense of commuting, shopping, or private travel. It was collective activity organized by season and obligation. The medieval village was deeply agricultural, and the agricultural year was the true master of time. Plowing, sowing, weeding, haymaking, harvesting, threshing, repairing fences, cleaning ditches, gathering wood, tending animals, maintaining tools, brewing, baking, spinning, washing, and carrying water all had their place. Some work was gendered, some shared, and much depended on age, health, and status. Children worked too, often from a very young age, not because childhood was unrecognized, but because every household needed useful hands. The fields surrounding the village were often managed through the open field system in many parts of medieval Europe. Rather than neat, fenced farms owned and worked in isolation, villagers commonly held scattered strips across large shared fields. This arrangement could seem inconvenient to modern eyes, but it reflected a deeply communal structure of agriculture. Decisions about plowing, sowing, and harvesting had to be coordinated. One family's actions could affect everyone. The village was, in that sense, a cooperative body, though not always a harmonious one. Neighbors depended on one another, but they also watched one another closely, argued over boundaries, complained about animals straying, and carried long memories of insult or debt. Over all of this stood the manor and the lord's authority. Not every medieval village was identical, and conditions varied widely across regions and centuries, but many villagers lived within a manorial framework. This meant that peasants owed rents, labor services, or other dues to a lord who controlled the manor. Some peasants were freer than others. Some held land by customary rights that gave them a stable place in village life, while others faced heavier burdens. But however the legal details differed, village people generally did not live in a world of complete independence. Their labor and landholding were tied to systems of obligation that reached upward into the structures of medieval power. So a morning in the fields was never just a matter of personal effort. It was shaped by duty. A villager might be working his own strips one day and the lord's domain on another. He might owe carting services, harvesting labor, or payments in kind. The success of his family depended not simply on how hard he worked, but on weather, soil quality, disease, taxes, local custom, and the demands placed upon him from above. Medieval peasants were not passive figures drifting through hardship. They were skilled, observant, and experienced people, but they lived in a world where one bad harvest could undo years of careful effort. The sounds of the village changed as the day went on. The crack of wood, the scrape of tools, the lowing of cattle, the calls of children, the creak of carts, the barking of dogs, and the bells from the church all formed the soundscape of everyday life. The parish church, often modest in size but immense in importance, stood at the spiritual heart of the village. Even people who rarely traveled far would be deeply shaped by the church calendar. Saints' days, feast days, fasting periods, baptisms, marriages, funerals, and the weekly rhythm of worship gave sacred meaning to ordinary time. Medieval religion was not a distant doctrine reserved for scholars. It was woven into the field, the home, the body, and the fear of what came after death. That fear was real, but so was comfort. The church offered both warning and reassurance. It explained suffering, gave structure to grief, and placed village life within a much larger story of sin, judgment, and salvation. A failed crop might be understood partly through weather, but also through divine will. Illness might be treated with herbs and practical care, but prayer and ritual would likely stand beside them. The village priest was not always highly educated by later standards, and rural clergy varied greatly in ability and reputation, but the church remained one of the few institutions that touched every stage of life around midday. Work paused, though not always for long. The meal would often be another modest one, perhaps more bread, more pottage, maybe cheese, maybe onions, maybe ale. In harvest season especially, time was precious, and long breaks were a luxury. Yet even hard labor required rhythm. Bodies could not work endlessly. Medieval people understood exhaustion very well because they lived beside it. Their work was physical in a way that many modern people rarely experience. Digging, lifting, sowing, reaping, threshing, carrying water, chopping wood, and grinding grain demanded stamina and repetition. The body itself was a tool of survival, and injury or illness could threaten an entire household. Women's work was everywhere in the village, though later storytelling has often pushed it into the background. Women prepared food, brewed ale, cared for children, kept household order, worked in fields, tended gardens, looked after animals, spun thread, mended clothing, and managed countless tasks that made daily life possible. Their labor was not secondary. It was essential. In poorer households especially, the boundary between domestic and agricultural work was thin. The house was not separate from the economy. It was the economy. Children grew up quickly into this world of necessity. They learned by doing. A young child might gather eggs, fetch water, scare birds from crops, carry fuel, or help mind younger siblings. As they grew older, tasks became heavier and more skilled. There was affection in medieval family life, but there was also fragility. Disease was common. Many children did not survive to adulthood. Many mothers faced real danger in childbirth. Death was familiar in a medieval village in a way that is difficult for many modern viewers to fully imagine. And yet daily life continued. Fields still had to be worked. Bread still had to be baked. Animals still had to be fed. Grief had to fit itself around labor. Not everyone in the village was equal, and the hierarchy would have been visible in clothing, diet, landholding, and authority. Some villagers held more land, more animals, and more influence. Others lived on the edge of need. There were craftsmen in some villages too, though larger specialization usually belonged more to towns. A blacksmith, a miller, a carpenter, or a reeve might stand out in village society. The mill in particular held great importance. Grain had to be ground, and in many places villagers were required to use the Lord's mill and pay for the service. The mill was practical, economic, and symbolic all at once. A reminder that even turning grain into bread often passed through authority and payment. By afternoon, the village landscape could look peaceful to an outsider, but that peace was built on relentless effort. Medieval rural life was not motionless. It was intensely busy, shaped by season more than by clock time. Spring brought plowing and sowing. Summer demanded maintenance and haymaking. Autumn was dominated by harvest, the most crucial and exhausting period of all. Winter did not mean idleness. It brought repairs, slaughtering, tool work, textile production, and the careful stretching of supplies. Every season had its pressures, and behind each one stood the same question. Would there be enough? That question defined more than diet. It defined emotion. Security in a medieval village was never absolute. A storm, blight, animal disease were passing through. A lord's increased demands, or a regional famine could transform ordinary life into crisis. Most villagers were only a short distance from hardship. That vulnerability helps explain why custom mattered so deeply. Traditional rites, shared expectations, and communal rules were not mere habits. They were protections. To know when one could gather wood, graze animals, use common land, or claim access to water was to know how survival worked. And yet village life was not only suffering and pressure. There were also moments of rest, sociability, and celebration. People met at church, at the well, at the bake oven, in fields, on paths, and during seasonal festivals. They exchanged news, judged one another, arranged marriages, settled disputes, and maintained the fabric of community. Music, dancing, games, and feast days had their place. A medieval village was not emotionally flat. It contained affection, envy, resentment, devotion, humor, ambition, and pride. It was a human community in the fullest sense, compressed into a small space and bound together by necessity. As evening approached, work began to narrow back toward the household. Tools were gathered, animals were secured, water might be carried in. Supper would be prepared, often not very different from the earlier meals, but deeply welcome after a day of labor. Inside the house, firelight changed the feeling of the room. The world beyond the walls became darker and less certain. Night in the medieval countryside could feel immense. Without modern street lighting, darkness was powerful. It sharpened the boundaries of home, village, and wilderness. Beyond the familiar lanes lay woods, roads, strangers, weather, and the unknown. And that is where we'll pause for now, with the light fading over the fields, smoke rising from the roofs, and the village drawing inward after another ordinary day that was never truly simple. Because in the medieval village, even the most routine evening carried the weight of a whole civilization's way of living. As evening settled more firmly over the village, the pace of life slowed in a visible way. Medieval people rarely worked deep into the night unless necessity demanded it. Light was limited, and candles or oil lamps were expensive for most households. The hearth fire provided some illumination, but its glow was uneven and smoky, so the final hours of the day were often quieter, shaped by simple routines rather than heavy labor. Inside the house, supper might already be simmering in the same pot that had been used earlier in the day. The medieval cooking pot was rarely emptied completely. Instead, ingredients were added over time, creating a constantly evolving pottage. A handful of barley, a few beans, perhaps cabbage leaves or onions from the garden might be stirred in. If the family had managed to save a little bacon or salted meat, a small portion could flavor the whole dish. Even a bone could be valuable, releasing fat and taste into the stew. Bread remained the center of the meal. For poorer villagers, the bread was often dark and coarse, made from barley, rye, or mixed grains rather than fine wheat flour. Wheat bread existed, but it was usually reserved for wealthier households or special occasions. To a modern viewer it might seem plain, but for medieval villagers bread was deeply meaningful. In fact, the word companion itself originally meant someone you shared bread with. After a long day in the fields or workshops, the meal could feel like a moment of genuine comfort. Families gathered close to the hearth, sitting on benches, stools, or even directly on the floor. Conversation was simple and practical. They might discuss tomorrow's work, a neighbor's illness, news brought by a traveler, or concerns about weather and crops. In a world without printed newspapers, radio, or digital communication, information traveled slowly, but it still traveled. News often arrived through wandering merchants, pilgrims, clergy, or the occasional official passing through. Children might still have small tasks to finish before sleep. Water needed to be brought in, tools might need cleaning, animals checked once more. But as darkness thickened outside, most work gave way to rest. The human body had limits, and medieval villagers understood those limits well. Night in a medieval village carried its own atmosphere. Without electric lights, the sky itself appeared far brighter than most people today ever see. On clear evenings, the stars would stretch across the sky in enormous numbers, forming a familiar canopy over fields and rooftops. For villagers whose lives rarely extended far beyond the surrounding countryside, the heavens were both mysterious and constant. Yet darkness also brought unease. The medieval imagination was filled with stories about spirits, wandering souls, demons, and other unseen dangers of the night. Some of these beliefs came from Christian teaching, others from older folk traditions that had survived for centuries. People might leave a candle burning briefly for protection, whisper prayers before sleep, or make the sign of the cross as a quiet safeguard against whatever might move unseen beyond the door. Within the house, sleeping arrangements were simple. Beds were valuable pieces of furniture, and poorer families might share them or sleep on straw-filled mattresses laid directly on the floor. A single bed could hold several family members. Warmth mattered more than personal space, especially during winter months when cold winds slipped easily through the timber walls and thatched roofs. Gradually, the village fell silent. Fires burned lower, doors closed, animals shifted quietly in barns or nearby shelters. The day that had begun before sunrise came to its end not with entertainment or long leisure, but with exhaustion. For medieval villagers, sleep was not just rest. It was preparation for the same demanding rhythm that would begin again with the next dawn. But sleep in the medieval world was often different from what many people experience today. Historians studying old records, letters, and household accounts have found evidence that night was sometimes divided into two distinct periods of rest. People might fall asleep soon after dark, sleep for several hours, then wake naturally sometime around midnight. This quiet period in the middle of the night was not always seen as strange. In fact, it could be used for small tasks, reflection, prayer, or quiet conversation before returning to what was sometimes called the second sleep. In a small village house, the fire might still glow faintly during these hours, giving just enough warmth and light to keep the room from total darkness. Outside, the sounds of the countryside continued in subtle ways. Wind moved through trees. An animal might shift in a nearby pen. Occasionally a dog barked in the distance. Without the constant noise of modern life, these small sounds carried far across the night air. The medieval village itself was rarely surrounded by high defensive walls, especially in the earlier centuries of the Middle Ages. Instead, its protection came from familiarity and community. Everyone knew the narrow paths between houses, the position of wells, the fields beyond the edge of the settlement, and the dark shapes of barns or sheds. A stranger entering the village at night would quickly be noticed, which in itself acted as a kind of security. Still, there were people who remained awake through parts of the night. The village watch, where it existed, might rotate among able-bodied men responsible for keeping an eye out for fire, theft, or trouble. Fire was perhaps the greatest danger. With houses made largely of wood and thatch, a single uncontrolled flame could spread rapidly through tightly built homes. For this reason, maintaining the hearth carefully and watching sparks was a serious responsibility. Eventually, most villagers returned to sleep until the earliest hint of morning appeared. Dawn did not arrive suddenly. First came a slow lightening of the horizon, often accompanied by the sounds of animals beginning to stir. Roosters were famous for marking the approach of day, though in reality the entire countryside participated in this gradual awakening. And once again, the cycle of work would begin. What's important to understand is that a medieval villager did not see this routine as monotonous in the way modern observers sometimes imagine. Life was structured by patterns that repeated year after year, but those patterns carried meaning. Each season brought different tasks, different foods, and different concerns. The arrival of spring meant the promise of planting. Summer meant growth and maintenance. Autumn meant harvest and relief if the crops were good. Winter meant survival, repair, and patience. These rhythms connected villagers not only to the land but also to one another. Few people could manage agricultural life completely alone. Plowing large fields often required shared teams of oxen. Harvesting demanded many hands working quickly before weather could damage the crop. Even building houses or repairing structures could become community efforts. So while a single household experienced the day directly, the village functioned as a larger organism. People watched each other's work, depended on each other's cooperation, and sometimes judged each other harshly when responsibilities were not fulfilled. Reputation mattered enormously. A hard-working neighbor earned respect. Someone seen as lazy, dishonest, or disruptive might quickly find themselves the subject of gossip or complaint. This close social world meant that conflicts rarely remained private for long. Disputes over land boundaries, animals wandering into crops, unpaid debts, or broken agreements were common. Many of these issues were settled through the manor court, a local legal assembly that met periodically under the authority of the lord or his representative. Villagers themselves often served as jurors or witnesses, meaning the community played an active role in maintaining order. In this way, the medieval village was both cooperative and watchful. It required people to work together, but it also required them to live constantly in the view of their neighbors. Privacy, again, was limited. Reputation, obligation, and tradition shaped everyday behavior in ways that were powerful and difficult to escape. And as another dawn approached over the fields, the village prepared to begin the same demanding, structured, and deeply communal life all over again. As the first light of dawn slowly spread across the fields, the medieval village began its quiet awakening once again. Morning rarely arrived with sudden movement. Instead, it unfolded gradually, almost gently, as faint gray light revealed the shapes of cottages, barns, fences, and distant trees. The roofs of thatched houses often carried a thin layer of morning dew, and in colder months a pale frost might cover the ground, crunching softly beneath early footsteps. For villagers, the beginning of the day was rarely a matter of choice. The needs of land and animals set the schedule. A cow waiting to be milked, chickens eager to leave their coop, or oxen needing to be prepared for field work all demanded attention soon after sunrise. The household stirred again, much as it had the day before. A parent might rise first, moving quietly to revive the hearth fire while others slowly woke in the dim interior of the house. The hearth remained the center of domestic life. Its warmth pushed back the chill of morning air, and its smoke slowly escaped through openings in the roof or simple chimneys. The smell of burning would mix with the scent of damp straw, wool clothing, and yesterday's cooking pot. These were the ordinary smells of medieval living, familiar to every villager from childhood. Breakfast, when it occurred, was simple and quick. Medieval villagers did not always begin the day with a large meal. Instead, they might eat a small piece of bread, perhaps with cheese or leftover pottage from the previous night. Ale or weak beer could accompany the meal, even in the morning, because fermented drinks were often safer than untreated water sources. This early nourishment was less about comfort and more about preparing the body for labor. Soon after eating, the village paths began to fill with movement. Men, women, and older children walked toward fields carrying simple tools: hoes, wooden rakes, sickles, or plows drawn by oxen. Others remained near the houses, tending gardens, repairing tools, preparing wool for spinning, or caring for animals. Every member of the household had some role to perform, and these roles were shaped not only by gender but by age, health, and experience. One of the most important features surrounding many medieval villages was the open farmland divided into long strips. Each family held several narrow plots scattered throughout the larger fields. This arrangement meant that villagers often worked side by side with neighbors. From a distance, a morning in the fields might appear almost communal, with lines of workers bending over crops or guiding animals along furrows of earth. Plowing was among the most demanding tasks. The heavy medieval plow, especially in northern Europe, required the strength of oxen teams to cut through thick soil. Guiding such a plow demanded patience and physical effort. A single mistake could damage the furrow or slow the work of everyone nearby. Because of this, plowing was often done cooperatively, with several families sharing animals and labor. While the men handled much of the plowing and heavy field work, women's labor filled equally essential roles throughout the day. Many women worked in the fields during planting and harvest seasons, but they were also responsible for tasks that sustained the household economy. Spinning wool into thread was one of the most constant activities. The production of thread and cloth required enormous time and skill, and clothing could not simply be purchased in shops as it is today. It had to be made, repaired, and maintained within the household or local community. Gardens near the homes were also extremely important. These small plots provided vegetables and herbs that supplemented the grain harvest from the fields. Onions, leeks, cabbage, peas, beans, and various herbs could grow in these spaces. Though modest in size, the garden could make the difference between a diet of simple grain and a more varied supply of food. Meanwhile, younger children might spend the morning performing smaller but meaningful duties. They could gather eggs, watch over grazing animals, collect firewood from nearby woodland, or carry water from the village well or stream. Through these daily responsibilities, children gradually learned the practical skills required for adult life. Education in the medieval village was rarely formal. Instead, knowledge passed from generation to generation through observation and participation. The village itself was never entirely silent during these hours. The ringing of the church bell might mark certain moments of the day, reminding villagers of prayer times or signaling gatherings. The bell served not only a religious purpose but also a practical one. In a community where most people worked outdoors across scattered fields, sound carried important information. The parish church remained a central landmark visible from nearly every part of the village landscape. Its tower or steeple rose above the cottages and fields, a constant reminder of spiritual authority. Even on ordinary weekdays, villagers might pause briefly to offer a prayer or cross themselves when hearing the bell. Faith was deeply woven into daily routine, shaping how people understood both hardship and fortune. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the work continued steadily. The medieval villager did not measure the morning in hours but in progress. How much ground had been plowed, how many weeds had been pulled, how much grain had been harvested or prepared. The rhythm of tools striking soil, animals moving slowly through fields, and voices calling across the farmland formed the living soundtrack of rural life. By the time the sun reached its highest point in the sky, the pace of work in and around the village had already been steady for many hours. Medieval villagers were deeply accustomed to long stretches of physical labor, but even the most experienced farmer needed pauses throughout the day. Around midday, work in the fields often slowed as people gathered briefly to eat, rest their backs, and drink. These breaks were usually simple and practical rather than leisurely. Workers might sit along the edge of a field, beneath the shade of a tree, or beside a wooden cart carrying tools and supplies. The meal itself was rarely elaborate. A cloth or small sack might reveal dark bread, perhaps a wedge of cheese, onions, or a little leftover stew carried from home. In harvest season, when every moment of daylight was precious, meals could be especially quick, eaten while sitting among the very crops that had to be gathered. Ale or weak beer was commonly consumed during these pauses. Medieval brewing was often done within households or by local specialists in the village. The drink was usually lower in alcohol than many modern beers and served as a reliable source of hydration and calories. Grain that could not easily be stored as bread sometimes found new life through brewing, and so ale became a familiar part of daily nourishment. Midday also allowed villagers to exchange news and observations. Though the medieval countryside might appear isolated, communication flowed constantly through conversation. People discussed weather patterns, animal health, crop conditions, and rumors from nearby towns. A passing traveler could easily become the focus of curiosity, bringing stories from distant markets, religious pilgrimages, or political events unfolding far beyond the village boundaries. These conversations were not simply casual chatter. In an agricultural society where success depended heavily on environmental conditions, shared knowledge mattered. Farmers observed the sky carefully, paying attention to cloud patterns, wind direction, and seasonal changes. Experience passed from older villagers to younger ones, shaping decisions about planting, grazing, and harvesting. The medieval farmer relied on memory and tradition as much as physical labor. After the short rest, work resumed with renewed urgency. The afternoon often required just as much effort as the morning, especially during key periods such as haymaking or harvest. Cutting grain with a sickle, for example, demanded repetitive and careful movements hour after hour. Each stalk had to be gathered, cut, and bundled. The bundles were then stacked into sheaves that could dry properly before being transported for threshing. Threshing itself, which separated grain from its stalks, usually took place later in barns or sheltered spaces. Using wooden flails, workers struck the dried grain repeatedly until the kernels loosened. It was slow, exhausting work, but absolutely necessary. Without threshing, the harvest could not become flour, bread, or ale. While field labor continued, activity within the village also carried on. The blacksmith's workshop might echo with the steady ringing of hammer on metal as tools were repaired or shaped. Agricultural tools wore down quickly under constant use, and a skilled blacksmith was one of the most valuable craftsmen in any rural settlement. Plowshares, horseshoes, nails, and blades all required attention. Nearby, the village mill could be turning steadily as well. Mills were crucial to medieval life because grain had to be ground into flour before it could become bread. In many places, villagers were required to bring their grain to the Lord's mill rather than grind it privately. This system ensured that the Lord received a portion of the grain as payment, reinforcing the economic structure of the manor. The miller, who operated the machinery, often held a complicated position within village society. On one hand, the mill was essential. On the other, millers were sometimes viewed with suspicion, as villagers occasionally feared that grain might be secretly withheld or measured unfairly. Whether these suspicions were justified or not, they show how sensitive food supply was in a world where every harvest mattered. Throughout the afternoon, children continued their own forms of work and learning. Some helped scare birds away from crops, waving sticks or shouting to protect valuable grain. Others gathered small branches for fuel or assisted with household tasks. The work might seem minor, but each action contributed to the fragile balance of rural survival. Meanwhile, women working within the household might spend hours spinning wool into thread using a spindle or early spinning tools. The steady twisting motion turned loose fibers into usable yarn, which could later be woven into cloth. Clothing production required an enormous investment of time. A single garment represented many hours of preparation, spinning, weaving, cutting, and sewing. As the afternoon lengthened, shadows began to stretch across the fields. The sun's gradual descent signaled the approaching end of the workday, though there were always final tasks to complete. Animals needed to be guided back toward barns or pens. Tools had to be collected and stored safely. Grain bundles might be gathered into larger stacks before evening moisture settled over the land. For many villagers, this final stretch of the day carried a quiet sense of relief. The hardest labor was nearly finished, and the familiar routines of evening awaited. As the sun moved lower toward the horizon, the long afternoon of labor gradually gave way to the quieter routines of evening. In the medieval village, the end of the workday did not arrive suddenly, but unfolded slowly as shadows lengthened across the fields. Workers who had spent hours bending over crops or guiding animals through heavy soil now began gathering tools, tying bundles, and preparing to return home. The paths leading back toward the village slowly filled again with movement. Small groups of villagers walked together, often carrying tools over their shoulders or pushing wooden carts with supplies from the fields. The pace was slower now. Fatigue after a full day of physical work was unavoidable, and people rarely rushed unless weather threatened the crops or an urgent task demanded attention. Animals also returned with their owners. Sheep might be guided into simple enclosures, cows brought back to be milked, and oxen carefully unyoked after a day of pulling plows or carts. Caring for animals at the end of the day was as important as caring for them in the morning. A sick or injured animal could represent a serious loss for a household, especially if it was an ox used for plowing or a cow that provided milk. Within the village itself, the evening brought a slightly different kind of activity. Smoke once again rose from the chimneys of houses as hearth fires were revived or strengthened. The smell of cooking drifted slowly through the narrow lanes between cottages. While meals remained simple by modern standards, supper was often the most complete meal of the day, especially after long hours of work. Women and older children might be busy preparing food while others finished small chores outside. Water was carried from the well, firewood stacked near the doorway, and animals given their final feed for the night. These routines were so familiar that they were performed almost automatically, repeated day after day across generations. Inside the house, the firelight created a warm glow that softened the rough wooden walls and simple furniture. A medieval home rarely contained many possessions, but the items it did hold were important. Wooden bowls and spoons, iron cooking pots, storage chests for clothing or grain, and perhaps a few treasured personal objects. Every item had a practical purpose. Supper might again consist of bread and pottage, though the ingredients could vary depending on the season and the household's resources. Fresh vegetables from the garden might appear in the pot, or perhaps a small portion of salted meat preserved from earlier slaughtering. If the family kept a cow or goats, milk or cheese could accompany the meal. In wealthier households within the village, the food might be somewhat richer, but for most villagers nourishment remained modest and practical. After eating, the evening offered one of the few opportunities in the day for rest and conversation. Families gathered near the hearth, where the warmth helped ease the aches that came from hours of physical labor. Hands that had spent the day gripping tools or gathering crops now turned to quieter tasks. Spinning wool was especially common during these hours. A spindle or distaff could be used while sitting, allowing thread production to continue even during moments of relaxation. This quiet work helped ensure that the household would eventually have enough yarn to weave cloth for clothing. In a society where fabric was expensive and precious, every bit of thread mattered. Stories and conversation also played a role in evening life. Without books or widespread literacy among peasants, oral storytelling remained an important way of sharing memory and entertainment. Older villagers might recall events from their youth, speak of unusual seasons or harsh winters, or repeat tales that had been passed down for generations. These stories sometimes mixed everyday experience with folklore. Legends about saints, wandering spirits, or strange happenings in distant forests could easily find their place in evening conversation. Such stories were not necessarily meant to frighten, but to explain the mysterious world that surrounded the village. Religion also appeared naturally in these moments. A family might say evening prayers together before sleep, thanking God for the safety of the day and asking protection for the night ahead. Faith in medieval life was not limited to church services on Sundays. It flowed through daily routines, shaping how people understood success, illness, misfortune, and hope. Outside, darkness gradually settled across the countryside. Without modern lighting, the transition from evening to night felt profound. The fields that had been busy with workers only hours earlier now became quiet and shadowed. The only steady lights came from hearth fires glowing faintly through doorways or small windows. This deep darkness influenced how villagers experienced the world. Travel after nightfall was uncommon and often avoided unless absolutely necessary. Roads and paths were difficult to see, and the countryside could feel unpredictable. Wolves and other wild animals still existed in some regions, and the absence of artificial light made every unfamiliar sound seem larger. Yet within the village itself there was also a sense of shared safety. Houses stood close enough together that neighbors were never far away. Dogs barked when strangers approached, and villagers knew the rhythms of their own community well. The presence of familiar people and routines created a feeling of stability in a world that could otherwise be uncertain. Gradually, one by one, households began preparing for sleep. As the night deepened, the medieval village settled into a quiet that modern life rarely experiences. Without the constant hum of machines, traffic, or electric lights, darkness truly belonged to the countryside. The narrow dirt paths between houses disappeared into shadow, and the outlines of barns, fences, and trees blended into the blackness beyond the faint glow of hearth fires. Inside the cottages, families prepared for sleep. Bedding was simple compared to modern standards. Wealthier households might have wooden bed frames with mattresses stuffed with straw, feathers, or wool. Poorer families often relied on straw pallets laid directly on the floor. These could be covered with rough blankets or simple wool cloths to provide warmth. Sharing sleeping space was completely normal. Parents, children, and sometimes even extended family members slept close together. Warmth mattered far more than privacy, particularly during winter months when cold air easily slipped through the gaps in wooden walls or beneath thatched roofs. Medieval homes were not tightly sealed buildings. Wind, smoke, and seasonal dampness were constant companions. Clothing might not be fully removed before sleep, especially during colder weather. Tunics or undergarments could remain on, adding another layer of warmth during the long night. The fire in the hearth was usually not allowed to burn freely while everyone slept. Instead, it was carefully banked, covered with ash or arranged so that only a small glow of embers remained. This prevented accidental fires while still preserving enough heat to restart the flames in the morning. Outside, the village animals also settled into their own nightly stillness. Chickens rested in their coops, sheep gathered tightly in enclosures, and cattle lay quietly in barns or simple shelters. Livestock represented wealth and survival, so villagers often kept them close to home where they could be protected from theft or predators. Yet night was never completely silent. The countryside always carried subtle sounds. Wind moved through hedges and trees. An owl might call from the edge of the woods. Occasionally, a distant animal cry echoed across the fields. To villagers who had grown up hearing these sounds, they were familiar parts of the landscape rather than reasons for alarm. The sky itself was one of the most striking features of the medieval night. With no electric lights to wash away the stars, the heavens appeared vast and intensely bright. Thousands of stars stretched across the sky in clear weather, forming patterns that people had observed for generations. Though medieval villagers did not practice astronomy in the modern scientific sense, the movement of stars and the moon still held deep meaning. They guided agricultural timing, influenced religious calendars, and inspired countless stories and beliefs. Many people in the village would have held strong ideas about the unseen world that existed alongside daily life. Medieval belief systems combined Christian teachings with older folk traditions that had been passed down for centuries. People spoke of guardian saints, protective prayers, wandering spirits, and supernatural forces that might move through forests or crossroads at night. Because of these beliefs, nighttime often carried a spiritual dimension. Families might say prayers before sleep, asking for protection from illness, misfortune, or evil spirits. Small rituals, such as making the sign of the cross or placing certain objects near the bed, could offer comfort in a world where danger was never entirely predictable. Even so, most villagers were simply exhausted by the end of the day. Hours of agricultural labor created a physical tiredness that required little encouragement for sleep. Bodies that had spent the day plowing, harvesting, carrying water, or tending animals quickly surrendered to rest once darkness fully settled. Yet, as historians have discovered, sleep itself sometimes followed a pattern unfamiliar to many modern people. Instead of one uninterrupted stretch of sleep, villagers often experienced two periods of rest. The first sleep began soon after nightfall. After several hours, some people naturally woke during the middle of the night. This quiet interval, sometimes lasting an hour or more, was used for small tasks, prayer, reflection, or conversation before returning to what was often called the second sleep. In a medieval house lit only by faint embers, this middle period of wakefulness could feel strangely calm. The world outside remained silent and dark, while the house held a gentle warmth from the fire's glow. A person might stir the embers, check on a child, whisper a prayer, or simply sit quietly for a moment before lying down again. Eventually, sleep returned, carrying the household through the final hours of night. Gradually, the eastern horizon began to lighten once more, almost imperceptibly at first. The cycle of darkness slowly loosened its hold as the first hints of dawn appeared. Soon the familiar sounds of morning would begin again. Roosters calling, animals shifting in their pens, and villagers rising to greet another demanding day. The rhythm of medieval life was relentless but steady. Each sunrise meant work waiting in the fields, animals needing care, tools needing repair, and neighbors depending on one another. For the people of the medieval village, this repeating cycle was not simply routine. It was the structure that held their world together. Every day followed patterns shaped by the land, the seasons, the church, and the obligations of community. But if we step back for a moment, a full day in a medieval village was more than just a sequence of chores, meals, and sleep. It was part of a much larger system that connected every villager to forces far beyond the small cluster of houses they lived in. Even though many peasants might spend their entire lives within a few miles of their birthplace, their daily work still supported kingdoms, churches, and economies that stretched across entire regions. The grain grown in village fields did not only feed the people who harvested it. A portion often went to the lord of the manor as rent or tax. Another share might support the local church through the tithe, a traditional payment of 1/10 of agricultural produce. These obligations meant that the work done in the quiet countryside helped sustain the wider structures of medieval society. The lord's manor house, which might stand nearby or within the village itself, symbolized this hierarchy. The lord did not necessarily live there all the time, but his authority was always present. His steward or reeve managed the estate, keeping records of rents, organizing labor services, and overseeing the fields that belonged directly to the lord. These lands, known as the domain, were often worked by peasants as part of their required duties. For villagers, this system could feel both protective and restrictive. The lord was expected to maintain order, provide legal authority through the manorial court, and sometimes offer protection in times of danger. In return, peasants owed labor, payments, and loyalty. The balance was not always fair, and disputes between villagers and their lords were not uncommon. But for centuries this structure formed the backbone of rural life across much of medieval Europe. The church represented another powerful influence over the village day. Even on ordinary weekdays, the church tower stood as a constant reminder that life had spiritual meaning as well as practical responsibilities. Bells marked time for prayer and gatherings. Religious festivals punctuated the year, offering rare moments of celebration and rest within an otherwise demanding agricultural schedule. Saints' days, Christmas, Easter, and other holy observances brought color and ceremony to village life. Processions, shared meals, and church services allowed villagers to step briefly outside the routines of farming and labor. These occasions reinforced a sense of belonging, not just to the village, but to the wider Christian world. Education in the modern sense was rare among peasants, yet villagers were not unskilled or unaware. Their knowledge of land, weather, animals, and seasonal rhythms was built over generations of experience. A farmer knew the feel of healthy soil in his hands. A shepherd could recognize subtle signs of illness in a flock. Women managing households understood food preservation, herbal remedies, and textile production in ways that required real expertise. Much of this knowledge passed quietly from parents to children. A boy might learn how to guide oxen through a plowed field simply by walking beside his father year after year. A girl might learn spinning, cooking, and gardening through constant participation in household work. The village itself functioned as a kind of living school where every task carried a lesson. At the same time, medieval villagers were not completely cut off from the outside world. Markets and nearby towns created connections that stretched beyond the immediate countryside. On certain days of the week, villagers might travel to market towns to trade surplus goods such as eggs, wool, vegetables, or crafted items. In return, they could obtain tools, salt, pottery, cloth, or other necessities not easily produced at home. Travelers passing through the region also carried news. Pilgrims journeying to religious shrines, merchants moving between towns, and wandering laborers seeking work could all bring stories of distant places. Through these encounters, even small villages remained loosely connected to the broader medieval world. Still, the core of life always returned to the same familiar landscape. The fields surrounding the village, the church bell marking the hours, the narrow paths worn by generations of footsteps. These were the constants that shaped every villager's experience. So when we imagine a single day in a medieval village, we are really looking at a small window into a much larger story. From sunrise labor in the fields to quiet evenings by the hearth, every moment was tied to land, community, and survival. The rhythm may appear slow from a modern perspective, but within that rhythm existed an entire civilization built on patience, cooperation, and endurance. And tomorrow, just like today, the village would wake again with the rising sun, ready to repeat the same careful balance of work, faith, and shared life that had sustained it for generations. If we could remain in the village a little longer, watching several days pass instead of just one, we would begin to notice something important. Life here was not only shaped by the daily rhythm of sunrise and sunset, but also by the slow turning of the seasons. For medieval villagers, the year itself was like a great wheel, and every day of work fit somewhere along that turning circle. Spring brought a sense of cautious renewal. After the long uncertainty of winter, villagers watched the fields carefully for signs that the soil was ready to be worked again. Plowing began as soon as conditions allowed. Oxen teams moved slowly across the land, pulling heavy plows that cut deep lines into the earth. Behind them, farmers scattered seeds: wheat, barley, oats, or rye, hoping that the coming months would bring the right balance of rain and sun. Spring was also a season of repair. Tools damaged during the previous year had to be fixed. Fences were mended to keep animals from wandering into newly planted crops. Houses weakened by winter storms were patched with fresh timber, mud plaster, or bundles of thatch. The entire village seemed to awaken with a quiet sense of preparation. Summer, in contrast, was the season of constant attention. Crops grew rapidly, but they required care. Fields needed weeding. Animals had to be moved between grazing areas. Hay had to be cut and dried so that livestock would have food during the coming winter. Haymaking could be especially intense work, since the grass had to be gathered quickly before rain spoiled it. During summer evenings, the village might remain active slightly longer than in other seasons. The longer daylight hours allowed people to extend their work, especially when weather conditions were favorable. But even then, the limits of human strength were always present. Medieval labor demanded endurance, and rest was essential for continuing the cycle. Autumn was perhaps the most important season of all. Harvest time determined whether the village would thrive or struggle through the winter months. Entire households worked together in the fields, cutting grain, bundling sheaves, and transporting them for storage. Neighbors often helped one another during these weeks because the window for gathering crops was narrow. A sudden storm could flatten fields and destroy months of effort. When the harvest was good, the mood in the village could shift noticeably. There was relief in knowing that grain stores were full and animals were well fed. Some villages marked the end of harvest with small celebrations or shared meals. These moments were not extravagant, but they offered a rare opportunity to acknowledge the success of the year's labor. Winter, however, brought a completely different pace. The fields rested beneath frost or snow, and the intense outdoor labor of farming paused for a time. Yet winter did not mean idleness. Inside houses and barns, work continued in quieter forms. Grain had to be threshed and ground. Tools required maintenance. Wool spun during long evenings could eventually become cloth for clothing or trade. Winter was also a time when storytelling, community gatherings, and religious observances took on greater importance. With fewer daylight hours available for fieldwork, villagers spent more time indoors, sharing news and memories beside the warmth of the hearth. The church calendar also filled the darker months with rituals and feast days that offered structure and meaning during the cold season. Over time, these seasonal patterns became deeply familiar to every person in the village. A child growing up in this environment would quickly learn that life was not measured by clocks, but by changes in weather, soil, and sunlight. The arrival of migrating birds, the budding of trees, or the first frost of autumn all carried clear signals about what work needed to be done next. What may seem to us like a repetitive existence was, for medieval villagers, a complex relationship with the natural world. Every day required observation and adaptation. Too much rain could ruin crops. Too little could dry the soil beyond recovery. A harsh winter might kill animals. A mild one could allow diseases to spread. Yet generation after generation managed to survive within this delicate balance. The medieval village endured because its people understood the rhythms of their environment and worked together within them. From dawn to dusk, from spring planting to winter fireside stories, their lives were shaped by patience, cooperation, and an unbreakable connection to the land beneath their feet. And so when the sun rose again over the small wooden houses, the narrow paths, and the open fields, the village returned once more to its quiet but determined rhythm. Another day beginning in a world where survival, faith, and community were woven tightly together. Over the course of many years, the patterns of life in a medieval village created something deeper than routine. They created identity. A villager did not simply live in a place. They belonged to a network of land, family, custom, and obligation that defined who they were. A person's home, their strip of farmland, the church they attended, and the neighbors who worked beside them formed the boundaries of their world. Most villagers would rarely travel far beyond those boundaries. A journey of even 20 or 30 miles could feel like entering a completely different region. Roads were often rough and slow, and travel required time away from work that most households could not easily spare. Because of this, the village community became the center of nearly every important event in life. Births, marriages, and deaths all unfolded within the same small circle of people. When a child was born, neighbors might assist with care or offer practical help during the difficult early days. When two villagers married, the event joined not only individuals but families whose cooperation might shape the future of shared fields and property. And when someone died, the entire community felt the absence, because every person contributed in some way to the delicate balance of work and survival. The churchyard often served as the resting place for generations of villagers. Over time, the graves surrounding the church became a quiet record of the village's history. Though many graves were simple and unmarked, villagers understood that their ancestors rested beneath the same ground where they worshipped and gathered each week. This connection between the living and the dead strengthened the sense that the village was not just a temporary settlement, but a continuing story passed from one generation to the next. The authority structures of the manor also shaped village identity. The manorial court met several times each year, bringing villagers together to settle disputes, record agreements, and enforce local customs. These gatherings were not grand legal trials like those seen in royal courts. Instead, they were practical meetings where neighbors testified about small conflicts, property boundaries, grazing rights, or broken obligations. Through these courts, villagers themselves often participated in maintaining order. A jury made up of local men might confirm whether a fence had been neglected or whether animals had damaged a neighbor's crops. The process reinforced the idea that the village functioned as a shared responsibility. While the Lord held ultimate authority, the everyday management of life depended heavily on cooperation among the villagers themselves. Yet, even within this tightly connected world, change slowly arrived over the centuries. Population growth, shifting trade routes, and developments in agriculture gradually altered how some villages operated. In certain regions, markets expanded and towns grew larger, drawing some villagers into wider economic networks. Craftsmen and traders could begin to specialize in ways that were less common in earlier centuries. Still, the essential character of village life remained remarkably stable for long periods of medieval history. Generations could pass with only gradual changes in technology or social structure. The same plows turned the same soil. The same church bells rang across the fields. The same footpaths wound between houses and barns. To modern observers, this stability might seem like stagnation, but to medieval villagers it offered something valuable: predictability. In a world where nature itself could be unpredictable, traditions and customs provided a framework that helped communities endure hardship. People knew what was expected of them, what they owed, and what they could rely upon from their neighbors. And so the medieval village continued its quiet existence year after year. Children grew into adults, fields passed from parents to sons or daughters, and houses were repaired again and again using the same materials and methods. The rhythms of planting, harvest, prayer, and rest repeated themselves across centuries. When we imagine a single day in such a village, from the pale light of dawn to the final glow of embers in the hearth, we are seeing more than an ordinary routine. We are witnessing the foundation of medieval society itself. Kings and nobles might dominate the chronicles of history, but it was the steady labor of villagers that sustained the entire structure above them. Their lives were not recorded in grand manuscripts or celebrated in royal halls. Yet in the quiet fields, the smoky cottages, and the narrow lanes of thousands of villages across Europe, the true daily engine of the medieval world continued to turn, one sunrise, one harvest, and one humble household at a time. And when historians today try to understand the medieval world, it is often these quiet villages that reveal the most about how society truly functioned. Castles and royal courts certainly shaped political power, but the everyday strength of medieval civilization rested in the hands of ordinary villagers. Their fields produced the grain that fed cities. Their wool supported growing textile trades. Their taxes and rents sustained lords, monasteries, and kings. A single village might appear small and unremarkable, but across Europe there were tens of thousands of them. Each one followed a similar rhythm of labor, faith, and cooperation. When viewed together, these communities formed the foundation of the medieval economy. Without them, the larger structures of power could not have existed. This is why the daily life of a medieval villager was both humble and deeply significant. The work done from sunrise to sunset, plowing soil, tending animals, baking bread, spinning wool, may have seemed ordinary to the people performing it. Yet these ordinary actions supported entire kingdoms. The village landscape itself reflected this long continuity of effort. Fields were shaped by generations of plowing. Paths between houses were worn smooth by countless footsteps. Hedgerows marked boundaries that had often existed for centuries. Even the placement of houses and barns followed patterns established long before the current villagers were born. Many villages grew slowly over time rather than through sudden expansion. A new cottage might be added when a son married and needed his own household. A barn might be rebuilt after a storm damaged the previous structure. The village gradually adapted to changing needs while still preserving its basic shape. Tools and techniques also evolved slowly. The heavy plow, horse collar, and improved farming methods gradually increased agricultural productivity in parts of medieval Europe. These innovations allowed some villages to cultivate more land and support larger populations. But even as improvements appeared, the essential character of village work remained grounded in human and animal labor. Life was not always stable or secure. Medieval villages faced serious challenges that could disrupt the familiar rhythm of daily life. Harsh winters, crop failures, animal disease, or regional conflicts could threaten survival. In some centuries, devastating events such as famine or epidemic disease reshaped entire communities. One of the most dramatic examples came during the 14th century with the arrival of the Black Death. Though villagers could not understand the disease in modern medical terms, they witnessed its devastating effects as entire households fell ill. Some villages lost a large portion of their population in a very short time. Fields were left unworked, and familiar neighbors suddenly vanished from daily life. Yet even after such tragedy, many villages slowly rebuilt. Surviving families adapted to new conditions, sometimes gaining more land or greater independence as population levels shifted. Over time, the quiet determination of rural communities allowed them to recover and continue their centuries-old patterns. Religion continued to guide villagers through these difficult moments. The church offered explanations for suffering, comfort in grief, and hope for a better life beyond the hardships of the present world. Prayers, processions, and religious rituals helped communities cope with fear and uncertainty. In the end, what stands out most about medieval village life is its resilience. These communities endured not because life was easy, but because people depended on one another. Shared labor in the fields, mutual help during harvest, and collective decision-making in village courts created a network of cooperation that allowed survival even in difficult times. So when the sun set once again behind the fields and the cottages grew quiet for the night, the medieval village was doing something remarkable in its simplicity. It was continuing a way of life that had endured for generations and would endure for generations more. From the first rooster's call at dawn to the final embers glowing in the hearth, every small task, every loaf baked, every seed planted, every animal cared for, helped sustain the fragile but enduring world of the Middle Ages. And in those quiet villages, far from the noise of royal courts or the walls of great castles, the true rhythm of medieval history quietly unfolded day after day. If we stood quietly at the edge of such a village and watched life unfold over many years, we would begin to see how deeply time itself was woven into everyday experience. Medieval villagers did not measure their lives by precise minutes or busy schedules. Instead, time was understood through natural signs. The rising of the sun, the ringing of church bells, the changing colors of the fields, and the shifting length of the days. Morning prayers might mark the beginning of activity, while evening bells reminded people to bring work to a close. The church calendar also gave structure to the passing weeks and months. Saints' days, fasting periods, and great religious festivals divided the year into meaningful chapters. Even people who could not read a calendar still knew exactly when certain seasons of worship or celebration were approaching. One of the most important of these moments was Sunday. Unlike the rest of the week, Sunday carried a sense of pause. Work in the fields was usually reduced or avoided, allowing villagers to gather at the parish church. For many people, this was the one time each week when the entire community came together in a single place. The church service itself was conducted in Latin, a language most villagers did not fully understand. Yet the meaning of the rituals was still clear through repetition, gesture, and tradition. The ringing of bells, the smell of incense, the glow of candles, and the familiar prayers created a powerful atmosphere that linked the small village to the wider Christian world. After the service, villagers often remained outside the church for a while. Conversations continued in the churchyard, where neighbors exchanged news, arranged marriages, discussed disputes, or simply enjoyed the rare opportunity to rest. These gatherings strengthened social bonds that were essential to village life. Markets also added occasional variety to the routine. While the village itself focused mainly on agriculture, nearby market towns served as important centers of trade. On certain days, villagers might walk or travel by cart to sell small goods such as eggs, butter, wool, or vegetables. In return, they could buy items that were difficult to produce locally: salt, iron tools, pottery, or cloth. These market visits offered glimpses of a larger world beyond the fields. Town streets were busier and noisier than the quiet lanes of the village. Merchants called out their prices, craftsmen displayed their goods, and travelers carried news from distant regions. For a villager who rarely left the countryside, such scenes could feel exciting and unfamiliar. Still, after the market day ended, most villagers returned quickly to their familiar surroundings. The village remained the true center of life. Its fields, houses, and church were not just physical places but anchors of identity and belonging. Children growing up in this environment absorbed its rhythms naturally. They learned when certain crops should be planted, how animals behaved in different seasons, and how the church calendar shaped the year. By the time they reached adulthood, the patterns of village life were already deeply understood. Marriage often came relatively early, and new households formed within the same community where both partners had grown up. Land, tools, and responsibilities passed from parents to children, continuing the chain of knowledge and labor that kept the village functioning. In this way, the medieval village carried a quiet continuity across generations. While kings might rise and fall, and wars might reshape distant borders, the basic rhythm of village life changed only slowly. Plows still cut the same soil, bells still echoed across the fields, families still gathered around hearth fires at the end of each long day. So when we imagine a single day in a medieval village, we are really seeing one small moment within a much longer story. That story stretches across centuries, built not by dramatic events but by countless ordinary actions repeated again and again. The villagers themselves might not have thought of their lives as part of history, They were simply doing what needed to be done, feeding their families, caring for their animals, and working the land that sustained them. Yet through those quiet routines, the entire medieval world continued to move forward, day by day, season by season, generation after generation. Over time, the steady rhythm of village life also shaped how people understood their place in the wider order of the world. Medieval society was often described as a kind of hierarchy, sometimes imagined as a great chain that linked heaven, kings, nobles, clergy, and peasants together. Most villagers would never meet a king, and many would rarely see their own lord in person. Yet they still understood that their work formed part of a larger structure. This understanding was reinforced through both custom and religion. Sermons in the parish church often reminded villagers that every person had a role given by God. Some were born to rule, others to pray, and many to work the land. To modern ears, this may sound restrictive, but for many medieval villagers it offered a kind of explanation for the hardships of life. Difficult labor, uncertain harvests, and simple living were often seen as part of a divine order rather than something that could easily be changed. That belief helped sustain patience in a world where opportunities for social mobility were limited. A peasant's life was rarely expected to transform dramatically. Instead, stability and continuity were valued. A good year in the fields, healthy livestock, and a peaceful household were considered signs of fortune. Even clothing reflected this structure of society. Villagers typically wore simple garments made from wool or linen produced locally. A tunic tied at the waist with a belt, sturdy shoes, and perhaps a cloak for colder weather formed the basic outfit for many people. Colors were often muted, since bright dyes required expensive materials. Yet clothing still carried meaning. The way someone dressed could hint at their trade, their status within the village, or their level of prosperity. Homes also reflected these differences. Some villagers lived in slightly larger timber houses with separate areas for storage or animals, while poorer families managed in smaller structures with very limited space. Over time, successful households might add small improvements, better roofing, sturdier beams, or additional storage chests for grain and tools. Despite these differences, most villagers shared the same fundamental experience of labor. The land demanded attention from everyone. Whether wealthy or poor by village standards, survival depended on understanding the soil, weather, and animals that shaped daily life. Occasionally, the calm routine of the countryside could be interrupted by events that reminded villagers of the larger world beyond their fields. A royal messenger might pass through carrying official orders. Soldiers could travel along nearby roads during times of conflict. Monks or pilgrims might stop briefly on their way to distant religious sites. These encounters offered glimpses of a wider landscape filled with cities, courts, monasteries, and distant kingdoms. Yet for most villagers, such moments were temporary. Once the travelers moved on, the quiet rhythm of agricultural life returned. And that rhythm remained remarkably durable. Long before the rise of modern industry or urban expansion, medieval villages had already developed systems that balanced cooperation, tradition, and survival. Fields were cultivated carefully to preserve soil. Animals were managed according to seasonal needs. Shared customs helped regulate how land and resources were used. At sunset, when villagers once again walked home along the familiar paths between fields, the village returned to the peaceful glow of hearth fires and evening conversation. The same cottages, barns, and narrow lanes that had existed for generations stood quietly under the fading light. Another day of work was ending, but the life of the village itself continued. Steady, patient, and deeply rooted in the land. And in that quiet persistence, repeated across thousands of villages throughout medieval Europe, the foundation of an entire historical era was quietly maintained. In many ways, the medieval village was a place where change happened so slowly that people often measured time through memory rather than dates. An older villager might recall the year a great storm destroyed several barns, or the winter when the river froze so solid that carts crossed its surface. These shared memories became markers in the story of the community, passed down through conversation and storytelling. Because written records were rare for ordinary people, much of the village's history lived only in the minds of its inhabitants. Elders remembered which families had worked certain strips of land for generations. They knew which boundaries had once caused disputes, and which agreements had finally settled them. Their knowledge helped maintain continuity in a society where tradition carried enormous authority. Land itself was one of the most important forms of stability. A family's strips in the open fields represented both livelihood and inheritance. When parents grew older, those strips might gradually pass to the next generation. This transfer was rarely simple, as land had to be divided carefully among children or negotiated through marriage arrangements. Yet these changes were managed within the community, often guided by the customs that had shaped the village for centuries. Marriage played a crucial role in maintaining this balance. In a small village, marriages often connected neighboring families, strengthening alliances that helped coordinate agricultural work. A marriage was not only a personal union but also a practical partnership. Two households might combine labor, animals, and tools to manage their fields more effectively. Weddings themselves were among the more joyful moments in village life. Though celebrations were modest compared to noble feasts, they still provided rare opportunities for music, shared food, and dancing. After long months of hard work, such gatherings offered a welcome release of energy and emotion. Festivals throughout the year also brought temporary changes to the routine. Seasonal celebrations tied to the church calendar could transform the quiet village into a lively place for a day or two. Decorations might appear around the church, special foods were prepared, and villagers gathered for processions or communal meals. These events reminded people that life was not only about labor but also about belonging to a shared cultural and spiritual tradition. Even during these moments of celebration, however, the presence of the land was never far away. Farmers still glanced at the sky, aware that weather could change quickly. Animals still required care. Fields still waited for attention once the festival ended. In the long stretches between such occasions, daily life returned to its familiar pace. Morning work, midday meals in the fields, quiet evenings beside the hearth. These patterns repeated so consistently that they shaped the rhythm of entire generations. What may surprise modern viewers is how much skill and knowledge this life required. Medieval villagers were not simply laborers performing simple tasks. Successful farming demanded a deep understanding of soil conditions, seasonal cycles, and animal behavior. A farmer knew when to plant by watching the temperature of the earth and the pattern of the winds. A shepherd could read the health of a flock through subtle changes in movement or appetite. Women managing households possessed equally valuable knowledge. They understood how to preserve food through salting or drying, how to treat common illnesses with herbs, and how to produce clothing from raw wool. These skills were essential to survival, especially during years when harvests were uncertain. In this way, the village functioned as a carefully balanced system. Each person's labor supported the others. The farmer relied on the blacksmith for tools. The household depended on the miller to grind grain. The priest guided spiritual life, while neighbors helped one another during planting or harvest. So when evening came again and the sun dipped behind the fields, the medieval village settled once more into the calm glow of firelight and quiet conversation. From the outside, it might appear simple, just a cluster of houses surrounded by farmland. But within that small space existed a complete and intricate society, shaped by cooperation, tradition, and the steady passage of time. And as another night spread across the countryside, the villagers rested, knowing that with the next sunrise the familiar rhythm would begin again. Another day in the enduring world of the medieval village. As we continue to imagine life inside the medieval village, it becomes clear that knowledge and skill were quietly built into every ordinary task. Nothing in village life happened completely by accident. Even the simplest activities, baking bread, repairing a roof, guiding animals through a field, required experience that had been refined over many generations. Take bread, for example. Bread was not simply food. It was the foundation of the medieval diet. But producing a loaf of bread required an entire chain of work stretching back months. Grain had to be planted at the right moment in the year, protected from animals and weeds, harvested carefully, dried, threshed, and then carried to the mill. Only after the grain was ground into flour could it return to the household, where it would be mixed with water and baked in an oven or over the hearth. Many villages shared a communal bake oven. Instead of every household maintaining its own oven, villagers sometimes used a single large structure built from clay or stone. Families brought their prepared dough to be baked in batches. This arrangement saved fuel and allowed bread to be cooked more efficiently. It also created another moment when villagers gathered together, exchanging news and conversation while waiting for their loaves. The same sense of shared effort could be seen in other parts of village life. When a house needed repairing, neighbors often helped. Timber beams had to be lifted into place, walls filled with wattle and daub, and thatched roofs tied securely against wind and rain. These tasks required more hands than a single family could provide, and so cooperation became a natural part of the process. Agricultural tools also reflected careful craftsmanship. A wooden plow, for example, might seem simple at first glance, but it had to be shaped precisely so that it could cut into soil without breaking. Iron parts forged by the blacksmith strengthened the tool and allowed it to last through repeated seasons of use. Without skilled craftsmen maintaining these tools, farming would quickly become far more difficult. Water, another essential resource, shaped the placement of many villages. Settlements often grew near streams, springs, or reliable wells. Fetching water was a daily responsibility, especially for women and children. Buckets were carried back to the house for cooking, washing, and animals. Because clean water sources were so important, the well or stream often became another small gathering place within the community. Sanitation in the medieval village was basic by modern standards, but villagers still developed practical habits for managing waste and keeping living spaces usable. Animal manure, for example, was rarely wasted. Instead, it was collected and spread across fields as fertilizer, helping maintain the fertility of the soil. In this way, even waste became part of the agricultural cycle that sustained the village. The surrounding landscape also provided resources beyond farmland. Woodlands supplied timber for building, branches for fuel, and sometimes wild foods such as berries or nuts. Many villages maintained shared rights to these woodland areas, allowing villagers to gather fallen wood or graze animals in certain seasons. These rights were carefully regulated because the forest, like the fields, had to support the entire community. Over time, villagers developed a deep familiarity with this landscape. They knew where certain herbs grew, which paths remained dry during heavy rain, and where animals preferred to graze. A child growing up in the village would gradually learn every corner of the nearby countryside, the shape of hills, the bends of streams, and the quiet places where birds nested in the hedgerows. This knowledge created a strong connection between people and land. The village was not simply a place where people lived temporarily. It was a home shaped by generations of labor and memory. Families planted trees whose shade their grandchildren might one day enjoy. Fields were improved slowly, one season at a time. So when evening returned and villagers once again gathered around their hearths, the quiet satisfaction they felt was tied to this long relationship with the land. Every repaired fence, every harvested field, every loaf of bread represented the careful work of many hands. And tomorrow, as the sun rose again over the thatched roofs and open fields, those same hands would continue the steady effort that had sustained the village for centuries, one ordinary day after another in the enduring world of medieval rural life. As we come closer to the end of our imagined day, it helps to remember that for the people who lived in these villages, life rarely felt like a historical period. They were not aware that they were living in what we now call the Middle Ages. To them, their world simply felt like the natural order of things, the way life had always been and, in many ways, the way it was expected to continue. The village itself often existed in the same place for centuries. Generations were born in the same cottages, baptized in the same church, married beneath the same wooden beams, and buried in the same churchyard soil. When a villager walked along the narrow path between fields, they were stepping where their parents and grandparents had stepped before them. This continuity created a strong sense of belonging. Even if life was physically demanding, there was comfort in familiarity. People knew the land around them intimately. They knew which fields drained well after rain, which areas were prone to flooding, and which patches of woodland provided the best firewood. The natural world was not something distant or abstract. It was the environment that shaped every decision. A farmer looked at the sky each morning not out of curiosity but out of necessity. The color of clouds, the direction of wind, or the feel of the soil beneath the boots could influence the entire day's work. Animals were just as much a part of this daily awareness. Villagers learned to read the behavior of their livestock carefully. A restless cow, a sheep that separated from the flock, or chickens that stopped laying eggs could signal illness or changing weather. Observing these details helped prevent small problems from becoming larger ones. Tools were maintained with the same level of care. Because replacing equipment was difficult and expensive, villagers repaired what they owned repeatedly. A wooden handle might be replaced while the iron blade was kept for many years. Small improvements, carefully made, allowed tools to serve families across generations. In the evening hours, when most of the work was finally finished, the village often felt calm in a way that is difficult to imagine today. Without bright artificial lights, the transition from day to night was gradual and complete. The glow from hearth fires flickered through doorways, and soft voices drifted between nearby houses. Sometimes neighbors visited one another during these quiet hours. A short walk along the lane might bring someone to a friend's doorway, where conversation could continue beside the fire. These visits helped maintain the relationships that were essential to community life. Stories were often shared during these moments. Some stories recalled real events from the village's past: harsh winters, unusual harvests, or encounters with travelers. Others carried elements of folklore. Tales of strange creatures in distant forests, mysterious lights seen on lonely roads, or saints who performed miracles. Whether true or imagined, these stories served an important purpose. They helped explain the unknown parts of the world and connected villagers to traditions older than themselves. Eventually, however, the fire would burn lower and the house would grow quieter. One by one, family members would prepare for sleep, knowing that dawn would arrive sooner than it seemed. The cycle of village life left little room for long nights of wakefulness. And so the village rested once again. Beyond the fields, beyond the forests, and beyond the small network of paths that connected neighboring settlements, the larger medieval world continued its own complicated story of kings, wars, and political change. But here, within the village, history moved at a different pace. The steady rhythm of sunrise and sunset, planting and harvest, prayer and rest continued to guide everyday life. In the quiet glow of the hearth and the soft darkness of the countryside night, the medieval village carried on, sustaining families, traditions, and communities one ordinary day at a time. As the hours of the night slowly passed, the medieval village rested in a silence shaped by centuries of routine. Most households were now asleep, their fires reduced to quiet embers glowing beneath a layer of ash. The cottages, built from timber and earth, held the warmth of the day inside as best they could. Outside, the air cooled steadily, and the village lanes, so active only hours earlier, lay empty beneath the wide night sky. If someone were awake at this hour, perhaps briefly rising during the middle of the night as many people did, the village would appear almost timeless. The shapes of the houses were only faintly visible. A small barn leaned beside one home, a stack of firewood beside another. The church tower stood darker than the sky behind it, its familiar outline reassuring to those who knew it well. Nighttime in the countryside could feel both peaceful and mysterious. The darkness extended far beyond the last cottage. Fields stretched outward, silent and still, bordered by hedges and small stands of trees. Without lamps or lanterns to illuminate the landscape, the village existed as a small island of human presence within a much larger natural world. Occasionally, a faint sound might break the stillness. A horse shifting in its stall, a dog barking once before settling again, or the distant call of an owl gliding across the fields. For villagers who had grown up hearing these sounds since childhood, they were part of the familiar music of the night. In these quiet hours, the connection between the village and the natural world felt especially clear. Medieval people lived much closer to the rhythms of nature than most people do today. The phases of the moon affected nighttime travel and sometimes even agricultural decisions. The arrival of certain birds signaled changes in the seasons. The length of daylight determined how long work could continue. Even sleep itself followed these natural patterns. Without artificial lighting, most villagers slept not long after darkness fell. Their bodies adjusted to the slow turning of the earth, rising with the early light and resting soon after sunset. The rhythm of human life was closely tied to the rhythm of the land. As the night slowly approached its end, the first signs of morning began to appear almost imperceptibly. The eastern horizon would gradually soften from black to deep blue. The stars faded one by one. A faint chill settled over the fields as dew formed on grass and leaves. Soon the animals would sense the coming day. Chickens rustled in their coops, and a rooster might call out sharply, announcing the arrival of dawn. In the barns, cattle stirred and shifted their weight, waiting to be fed or led out to pasture. Inside the cottages, someone would soon wake and move quietly toward the hearth. The embers from the night before would be uncovered and coaxed back into flame with small pieces of wood and careful breaths of air. Once the fire caught, warmth and light returned to the room. And with that small flame, the entire cycle of the medieval village would begin again. Another day of work waited in the fields. Another day of tending animals, repairing tools, preparing food, and cooperating with neighbors. The tasks might seem repetitive, but they were the foundation of life itself. For the villagers, this repetition was not meaningless. It was a form of stability in a world where so much else could change. Weather might shift, harvests might succeed or fail, and distant political events might occasionally reach even the countryside. Yet the daily rhythm of the village remained dependable. So as the sun slowly rose above the fields and light returned to the narrow lanes between cottages, the village awakened once more. Doors opened. Smoke rose again from chimneys. Footsteps moved toward the barns and the fields. And just like the day before, and the countless days before that, the quiet, determined life of the medieval village began again.